A single light kept burning on the frozen mountainside, while the rest of the valley disappeared into darkness. Yet the strangest part wasn't who was inside. Snow slammed against the steel door hard enough to make it shudder. Inside the underground shelter, wet gloves steamed beside a small stove, while a German shepherd stood frozen, staring at the entrance. Then, without warning, the dog let out a sharp bark and limped toward the tunnel as a distant sound echoed through the storm. "What do you think Ranger heard out there?" The wind sounded alive. Not like weather, not like nature. Something bigger, something angry. It slammed into the mountains of western Wyoming with enough force to shake windows, strip snow from ridges, and bury entire roads beneath drifts taller than pickup trucks. By midnight, the Wind River Range had disappeared. The mountains were still there, but no one could see them anymore. The storm had swallowed everything. Power lines snapped one after another across Fremont County. Ranch houses went dark. Generators froze. Cell towers flickered on and off as ice coated every exposed surface. The temperature dropped to 28 below zero, then 32, then lower. At the county emergency center in Lander, a deputy sheriff stood over a map covered in red marks. Every mark represented a family they couldn't reach. Every road leading into the high country had vanished under snow. The National Guard had already grounded helicopters. Visibility was too poor. No one was coming tonight. Not for anyone. Outside, the world had become white chaos. Inside, dozens of homes scattered across the mountains. People sat wrapped in blankets, listening to furnaces fail, listening to silence, listening to fear. And then there was the light. At first, nobody believed it. A rancher named Cole Barrett spotted it through the frost-covered window of his barn. Just a tiny glow far away on the eastern slope above the valley. One light, steady, unmoving. Cole narrowed his eyes. The storm threw curtains of snow across the darkness, but the light remained. Still there, still burning. He knew exactly where it was. Everyone did. The old hillside shelter. The place people joked about all summer. The place they called the vet hole. Cole remembered standing in Murphy's diner 6 months earlier, while men laughed over coffee. They laughed about the retired Special Forces veteran digging into a mountainside like a groundhog. They laughed about the German shepherd that followed him everywhere. They laughed about the concrete, the steel beams, the strange ventilation pipes sticking out of the hill. Somebody had asked if Ethan Walker planned to hide from aliens. Another man said the war had finally scrambled his brain. The room had erupted with laughter. Even Cole had laughed. Now the joke was the only building in the valley with a light on. A violent gust rattled the walls of the barn. Cole turned away from the window. His backup generator had died an hour earlier. The temperature inside the house was already dropping. His wife sat wrapped in blankets beside a propane heater. His grandson slept beneath 3 quilts. The little boy's cheeks looked pale. Cole glanced back toward the distant glow. The light was still there, steady, waiting. For the first time all winter, a thought crept into his mind. Maybe Ethan wasn't crazy. Maybe Ethan had seen something the rest of them missed. Another ranch, 7 miles away, was having its own problems. The Morgan family huddled around a wood stove that could barely keep up. Frost crawled across the inside of the kitchen window. Their youngest daughter wore 2 coats indoors. The family dog refused to leave the stove. Every few minutes, the father opened the door and stared into the storm. Nothing. No headlights. No plows. No help. Then he saw it too. A faint glow through the swirling snow. A single light burning where no light should have survived. "What is that?" his wife whispered. The man didn't answer, because he already knew. Everyone knew. The shelter. Ethan Walker's shelter. The place nobody believed in. Hours passed. The storm only grew worse. Wind screamed through pine forests. Trees cracked under the weight of ice. Snow buried fences. Cattle huddled against each other in frozen pastures. And somehow, through all of it, that light remained. Shortly after 2 in the morning, something happened. A pickup truck slid off a mountain road less than a mile from Ethan's property. The driver managed to crawl out before the vehicle disappeared beneath blowing snow. He staggered through darkness, half frozen, disoriented, certain he was going to die. Then he saw it, the light. A beacon shining through the storm. He started walking toward it. 1 step, then another, then another. The climb felt endless. The wind shoved him sideways. Snow filled his boots. His fingers stopped responding. Several times he fell. Several times he considered staying down. But the light remained, closer now. Brighter. Real. When he finally reached the hillside, he froze. Not from cold, from disbelief. The structure barely looked like a building. Most of it disappeared into the earth. Only the reinforced entrance remained visible above the snow. Warm yellow light spilled from the doorway. Smoke rose from a vent pipe. Not thick smoke, not wasteful smoke, just a thin stream against the black sky. Proof of life. The man stumbled forward. Before he reached the door, it opened. A German shepherd stood in the entrance, large, alert, watching him. Its ears pointed forward. Its amber eyes reflected the light. For a moment, neither moved. Then the dog turned and disappeared inside. The man heard a voice. Calm, steady. Come on in. He stepped through the doorway. Warm air hit him so suddenly his knees nearly buckled. The difference felt impossible. Outside was death. Inside felt like another season. The shelter was larger than he expected. Concrete walls, stone flooring, heavy wooden beams, lanterns, cots, food supplies, water containers. Everything organized, everything prepared. And people, a lot of people. Families sat wrapped in blankets. Children slept peacefully. An elderly couple drank coffee near a stove. A pregnant woman rested beneath a wool blanket. No panic, no chaos, just quiet, safe. The man turned slowly, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then he spotted Ethan Walker. The veteran sat near the far wall, sharpening a knife with slow, practiced movements. His gray beard caught the lantern light. His posture remained straight despite his age. Beside him lay the German shepherd. The dog rested with its head on its paws, watching everything, watching everyone. Ready. The man swallowed. You knew this was coming? Ethan looked up. The scraping of the sharpening stone stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the storm hammering against the mountain above them. Then, Ethan glanced toward the ceiling, toward the earth, toward the blizzard raging outside. I knew winter was coming, he said quietly. The answer somehow raised more questions than it answered. Questions that stretched back months. Back before the storm. Back before the shelter. Back before anyone believed. Back to the day the veteran everyone laughed at started digging into a mountain with only a German shepherd at his side. And no one realized they were watching the smartest thing anyone in the valley had done in years. 6 months earlier, the mountains looked completely different. The snow was gone. The pines were green. Creeks ran clear beneath the Wyoming sun. And Ethan Walker was awake at 3:17 inches the morning. Again, the bedroom was dark, except for a thin stripe of moonlight slipping through the curtains. Ethan sat upright before he was fully conscious, his breathing steady, his eyes already scanning. Door, window, hallway, exit. The routine happened so fast it felt automatic. Years earlier, it had kept him alive. Now, it simply kept him tired. Beside the bed, a large German shepherd lifted his head. Ranger didn't bark, didn't move. He simply watched, waiting. The old soldier rubbed a hand across his face and looked at the clock. 3 hours of sleep. Not bad. Some nights were worse. A loose piece of siding rattled against the cabin wall. Clack, clack, clack. The sound made Ranger's ears twitch. Ethan listened for a moment before standing. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet. Outside, the mountain was silent. No incoming weather, no danger, just wind. But he checked anyway. He always checked. The front porch light clicked on. Ethan stepped outside carrying a flashlight. Not because he needed it, because he always carried one. The beam swept across the yard. The truck. The woodshed. The tree line. Everything clear. The habit followed him everywhere. At the grocery store in Lander, he automatically chose seats facing the door. At Murphy's Diner, he noticed every new vehicle that entered the parking lot. At church, he knew where every exit was before the service began. Most people never noticed. A few did. Those people usually stopped asking questions. Ranger followed him around the cabin as dawn slowly painted the mountains blue. The dog moved with the quiet confidence of an animal that had spent years working alongside humans. Even retired, some instincts never disappeared. The scar on his back leg showed every morning when he stretched. A reminder of another life. Another job. Another close call. Ethan filled the coffee pot. Ranger waited beside the counter, not begging, just watching. The dog understood routines. Coffee first, breakfast second. Everything in order. The smell of bacon soon filled the cabin. Outside, the first sunlight touched the peaks of the Wind River Range. Golden, beautiful, cold. Even in June, mornings carried a bite in the mountains. Ethan carried his coffee onto the porch. Ranger settled beside his chair. Together they watched the valley wake up. Far below, ranchers were already moving cattle. Dust rose from distant roads. The world looked peaceful, but peace never lasted long inside Ethan's head. The sound came unexpectedly. A helicopter, tiny at first, barely noticeable, then louder, rotor blades echoing through the valley. Ranger immediately looked up. The coffee cup froze, halfway to Ethan's mouth. For a split second, the porch disappeared. The mountains disappeared. The summer morning disappeared. Instead, there was another valley, another country, dust, heat, the smell of diesel, the thumping of rotor blades over a landing zone, men moving quickly, voices in radios, someone shouting coordinates. The memory lasted less than 3 seconds. Then it was gone. Just a tourist helicopter flying toward Jackson. Nothing more. Ethan lowered the coffee cup. His knuckles had turned white around the handle. Ranger stood and nudged his hand. Once, twice. The dog knew. Maybe not the memory itself, but he knew the signs, the tension, the stillness. The way Ethan's eyes sometimes looked far beyond the mountains in front of him. The veteran scratched behind the dog's ears. Good boy. Ranger leaned into the touch. That simple gesture grounded him better than anything else. The rest of the town didn't understand Ethan. Most had stopped trying. Some called him stubborn. Others called him strange. A few called him broken. The truth was simpler. War had ended years ago. His body had returned. Parts of his mind never completely did. Around noon, Ethan drove into town for supplies. Murphy's diner was busy. Farmers, ranchers, retirees, the usual crowd. The moment Ethan entered, conversations softened slightly. Not enough to be rude, just enough to notice. Ranger waited patiently in the truck outside. Inside the diner, Ethan ordered black coffee and a sandwich. A booth near the window, back to the wall. Eyes on the entrance. Same as always. At the counter, 2 men quietly exchanged looks. One of them whispered something. The other chuckled. Ethan ignored them. He'd heard it all before. Mountain hermit, crazy vet, old soldier. Didn't matter. None of it changed his day. The waitress, Linda Harper, refilled his coffee. How's Ranger doing? Still smarter than most people. She laughed. That's probably true. For a moment, Ethan smiled. A real smile. Rare enough that even he seemed surprised by it. When he left the diner, Ranger greeted him exactly the same way he did every day. Tail wagging once. Not wildly. Just enough. As if saying, "You're back. Good." The drive home wound through miles of open country. Pine forests, rocky ridges, wide skies. The kind of landscape that made most people feel free. Ethan felt something else. Observant. Always observant. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to drop behind the peaks. Long shadows stretched across the property. Ranger suddenly stopped near an old structure, half hidden behind weeds. A weathered root cellar built decades earlier by Ethan's father. The dog sniffed the entrance, then looked back, waiting. Ethan followed. The old wooden door groaned when he pulled it open. Cool air drifted out from the darkness below, different from the outside air. Steady, almost unchanged despite the summer heat. Ethan paused, then stepped inside. A few minutes later, he was still standing there, thinking, listening, observing, and for the first time, a new idea began taking shape in the back of his mind. An idea that would soon make the entire valley laugh. The root cellar had been built sometime in the late 1970s. Ethan's father never talked much about it. Like most mountain men of his generation, he simply built things that worked and saw no reason to explain them. The structure sat half buried behind the cabin, beneath a small rise covered with sagebrush and pine needles. From the outside, it looked forgotten. Inside, it felt different. The summer afternoon above ground was nearly 80 degrees. Down in the cellar, the air remained cool and steady. Not cold, not damp, just constant. Ethan stood quietly for several minutes. listening, feeling, observing. The old military habit returned immediately. Collect information first, draw conclusions later. Ranger wandered through the cellar, nose close to the stone walls. The dog sniffed every corner before settling near the back wall. His ears relaxed, his breathing slowed. Even animals recognized comfort. Ethan pulled a small thermometer from his truck the next day. Then another, and another. Over the next 2 weeks, he began recording temperatures. Morning, afternoon, evening, every day. The numbers fascinated him. Above ground, temperatures swung wildly. The cellar barely changed. The difference wasn't small. It was significant. By July, he had filled an entire notebook. Temperature readings, wind directions, soil conditions, sun angles. The project slowly consumed his attention, not because he wanted a hobby, because he saw a problem nobody else seemed willing to admit. Every winter in the Wind River Range was a battle. People spent thousands on fuel, generators, propane, firewood, emergency repairs, and every year the mountains still won. Cabins froze, pipes burst, power failed, families struggled through months of cold. Yet beneath their feet sat millions of tons of earth holding a stable temperature. The answer seemed obvious. The more he studied it, the more obvious it became. One afternoon, Ethan drove into town and stopped by the county library. He checked out books on earth-sheltered construction, passive heating, thermal mass, historical structures. A librarian raised an eyebrow when she saw the stack. Building something? Thinking about it, she smiled. Good luck. Neither of them knew what kind of luck he would need. Back at the cabin, Ranger became his constant shadow. Whenever Ethan walked property lines, Ranger followed. When Ethan stopped to measure wind exposure on the eastern ridge, Ranger sat nearby watching the trees. When Ethan marked potential construction sites, Ranger wandered ahead, exploring. The dog seemed to enjoy the project. Or maybe he simply enjoyed having a mission again. Retired working dogs often struggled with boredom. Ranger never seemed bored around Ethan. One evening they climbed higher than usual onto the southern hillside overlooking the valley. The view stretched for miles. Rolling ranchland, pine forests, the distant ribbon of a highway. Sunlight painted everything gold. Ethan stood there for nearly an hour, watching how the wind moved. Watching where snow drifted even during summer storms. Watching how the slope naturally protected itself from northern exposure. By the time he walked back down, his mind was made up. The site was perfect. The following morning, he started staking out measurements. Ranger watched from 10 feet away, head tilted. Confused, Ethan drove wooden stakes into the ground, marked corners, measured distances, checked elevations, then measured everything again. Special Forces training had taught him something valuable years earlier. Slow planning saves fast mistakes. By the end of the week, a rough outline appeared on the hillside. 16 feet wide, 24 feet deep, partially buried. South-facing, protected from prevailing winter winds. The design lived entirely inside his notebook. For now, the first person to notice was his nearest neighbor. Old Frank Miller drove by in a dusty pickup and slowed near the property. What are all those stakes for? Ethan glanced up. Building project. Frank looked around. I don't see a foundation. You will. Frank nodded slowly. Not convinced. Not concerned either. Just curious. The real trouble started 2 weeks later. Murphy's Diner. Breakfast rush. The unofficial information center for half the county. Frank happened to mention Ethan's construction plans. Someone asked what he was building. Frank admitted he wasn't sure. Another rancher claimed Ethan was digging into the hillside. That single sentence spread through the diner faster than wildfire. By lunchtime, half the valley had heard a version of the story. By sunset, the rumors had become ridiculous. Underground bunker, doomsday shelter, secret military base, nuclear hideout. By the next morning, people were already laughing. Ethan didn't know it yet, but his name had become the town's favorite conversation. And the deeper he dug into the mountain, the louder those conversations would become. On the third morning of excavation, Ethan started the engine of his old backhoe. The machine roared to life. Dirt rolled down the hillside. The first trench opened. Ranger stood nearby, watching every movement. The project had officially begun. Far below in town, people were still laughing. Up on the mountain, Ethan kept digging, because he had spent enough years learning one important lesson. Sometimes being alone didn't mean you were wrong. Sometimes it simply meant you saw the storm before everyone else. By August, everyone in the valley knew about Ethan Walker's project. Nobody understood it. Most didn't try. Every morning, the old backhoe climbed a little higher into the hillside. Every evening, another section of earth disappeared. Truckloads of gravel arrived. Concrete forms appeared. Steel supports followed. From a distance, the construction site looked less like a home and more like some strange military installation buried in the mountain, which, of course, only fueled the rumors. Murphy's Diner had become ground zero for speculation. The breakfast crowd discussed Ethan almost daily. One man claimed he was preparing for the end of the world. Another said he was hiding from the government. Someone else suggested he simply missed living underground from his army days. The laughter usually started after that, and one name came up more than any other: Cole Barrett. Cole owned the largest cattle operation in the county. 3 generations of Barretts had worked the same land. People listened when he talked, and Cole loved talking, especially when Ethan Walker was the subject. "Man spends too much time alone," Cole announced one morning while stirring cream into his coffee. "That's what happens." A few people chuckled. "He ain't building a house." "What is he building then?" someone asked. Cole grinned. "A hole." The table erupted. "The vet hole." The nickname spread through town before lunch. By the end of the week, teenagers were driving past Ethan's property just to see it. A few even stopped along the road and took pictures. Ethan knew. Of course he knew. Small towns carried gossip faster than radio signals. But he kept working. One afternoon he drove into town for supplies. Steel brackets, pipe fittings, insulation materials, the usual. As he walked into the hardware store, conversations softened. Not completely. Just enough. Enough for him to notice. The clerk avoided eye contact. 2 men near the lumber aisle suddenly became interested in a stack of plywood. Then Ethan heard it. Not loud, not meant for him. The vet hole guy. A few snickers followed. Ethan didn't react. He simply loaded his supplies and left. Outside, Ranger sat waiting in the truck. The dog stood immediately when Ethan opened the door, tail moving once. A simple greeting. No judgment. No questions. No laughter. Just loyalty. Sometimes that was enough. Construction accelerated through late summer. The shelter slowly emerged from Ethan's notebook and into reality. The front wall took shape first. Heavy reinforced concrete, narrow windows positioned to maximize winter sunlight. A steel entrance door salvaged from an old government surplus yard. Ventilation shafts carefully angled through the hillside. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was random. Years earlier, in Afghanistan, Ethan had learned that survival often depended on details nobody noticed. A doorway facing the wrong direction. A roofline exposed to prevailing winds. Poor drainage after a storm. Small mistakes became big problems. Big problems got people hurt. So he measured everything twice, then checked it again. Ranger remained close through every stage of construction. The German shepherd seemed happiest when there was work to do. He carried gloves, dragged ropes, retrieved dropped tools. Sometimes he simply sat near the excavation and watched, guarding, waiting. Part of him still seemed convinced they were on a mission. One September evening, Ethan shut down the backhoe and stretched his aching shoulders. The sun hung low over the mountains. Orange light washed across the valley. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The change was subtle, but Ethan noticed. The dog wasn't looking at him. He was staring toward the tree line, completely still. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing. Just shadows beneath the pines. A breeze moved through the branches. Ranger remained fixed on the same spot. Alert. Focused. The way he reacted when something didn't belong. See something? The dog didn't move. Several seconds passed. Then whatever had caught his attention disappeared. Ranger relaxed. Slowly. Ethan filed the moment away. Another habit from his military years. Notice first. Explain later. The next morning, he found tire tracks near the access road. Fresh, unfamiliar, not unusual by themselves, but strange enough to catch his attention. The tracks stopped near the construction site, then turned around. Whoever made them hadn't approached the cabin. They had only visited the shelter. Ethan crouched beside the marks, studied the tread pattern. Half-worn all-terrain tires, full-size pickup, nothing remarkable. Still, something about it felt wrong. That evening, he installed motion lights around the work area, not because he expected trouble, because preparation cost less than regret. The following week brought more laughter, more jokes, more visitors slowing down on the county road to stare. One afternoon, a pair of teenagers leaned out a truck window. "Hey, Ethan." He looked up from a stack of concrete blocks. "You building a bunker?" The passenger laughed. "No." "What then?" Ethan glanced toward the shelter, then toward Ranger. The dog sat nearby, watching. Something that'll still be standing when winter shows up. The teenagers exchanged grins, then drove away laughing. Dust followed them down the road. Ethan returned to work. But for the first time, a strange feeling settled over the property. Not fear, not exactly. More like the sensation of being watched. Ranger felt it too. Over the next several days, the dog repeatedly checked the perimeter before settling down. His nose worked constantly. His ears twitched at sounds Ethan couldn't hear. Twice he growled toward the woods after sunset. Low, quiet. Warning, growls. Not aggressive, concerned. Then came the night. Everything changed. A cold wind swept through the mountains shortly after midnight. Ethan woke instantly. Not from a nightmare, from Ranger. The dog wasn't beside the bed. He was standing at the front window, completely rigid, staring into the darkness. And for the first time since construction began, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that someone had come onto his property. The clock beside the bed read 12:43 a.m. The cabin was silent. A.m. No wind, no storm, no animals scratching outside, just Ranger. Standing perfectly still at the front window, watching. Ethan swung his legs off the bed without turning on a light. Old habits. Darkness hid you. Light exposed you. Within seconds he had jeans, boots, and a jacket on. Ranger never took his eyes off the yard. The dog wasn't barking. That bothered Ethan more than barking would have. Barking meant uncertainty. Silence meant confidence. Ranger knew something was there. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. Cool September air rolled across the mountain. The moon hung low over the valley. Silver light stretched across the property. Everything looked normal. The truck, the woodshed, the excavation site, the tree line. Nothing moved. Yet Ranger remained beside him, muscles tense beneath his coat. The dog suddenly walked forward. Not running, not charging. Tracking. Ethan followed. Together they crossed the yard toward the hillside shelter. The flashlight beam swept across fresh dirt and construction materials. Then, Ethan stopped. Boot prints. Fresh. Clear. Someone had walked directly through the construction zone. The tracks hadn't been there earlier. That much he knew. He studied them carefully. One person. Adult. Work boots. Moving slowly. Not wandering. Inspecting. Tech. S. The tracks circled the excavation twice, then disappeared toward the woods. Ethan crouched beside one print. Ranger lowered his nose and sniffed. A faint growl vibrated deep inside the dog's chest. "Easy." The growl stopped immediately. The dog obeyed. But his eyes stayed fixed on the dark timber beyond the clearing. Whoever had visited was already gone. Ethan knew chasing them now would be pointless. Instead, he did what years of military training had taught him. Observe. Remember. Prepare. The next morning he walked the property again, this time in daylight. The tracks revealed more than they had the night before. The visitor had spent nearly 20 minutes around the shelter. They had examined support beams, looked at ventilation openings, walked around the future entrance. Too deliberate for curiosity, too focused. Something felt wrong. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove into town. Murphy's diner buzzed with conversation as usual. Coffee cups clinked. Waitresses moved between tables. Ranchers discussed cattle prices and weather forecasts. Then Ethan noticed something. The moment he entered, several conversations stopped. Not completely. Just enough. People glanced away when he looked toward them. A few men near the counter suddenly found their breakfasts fascinating. The feeling lasted only seconds, but Ethan recognized it. He had seen similar behavior before. People hiding information often became more interesting than the information itself. Cole Barrett sat near the front window. The rancher smirked when Ethan walked past. "How's the hole coming along?" Several people laughed. Ethan poured cream into his coffee. "It's coming." Cole shook his head. "You know what I heard?" Ethan didn't answer. Cole continued anyway. "Heard you're building yourself a mountain bunker." More laughter. Someone added, "Maybe he's expecting an invasion." The room chuckled. Ethan sipped his coffee. Calm. steady. The reaction seemed to disappoint Cole. Bullies preferred resistance. Resistance made the game fun. Without it, the joke lost energy. Ethan finished breakfast and left. Outside, Ranger greeted him at the truck. The dog's tail moved once, then he froze, head lifted, ears forward. He stared across the parking lot, at a dark pickup truck parked near the gas station. The truck immediately pulled away. Gone within seconds. Ethan watched it disappear down the highway. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. Back home, he decided to take additional precautions. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just preparation. Small markers appeared around the construction site. Tiny pieces of fishing line stretched between stakes. Loose gravel placed strategically near pathways. Natural indicators. Simple things. Things most people never noticed. Things that revealed movement. Ranger supervised every step. The dog seemed almost excited, like he finally had a mission again. For several nights, nothing happened. Then came the first snowfall. Only a few inches, barely enough to cover the ground. The mountains looked beautiful beneath fresh white powder. By sunrise, Ethan was already outside. Coffee steaming in one hand, flashlight in the other, checking his markers. Halfway up the slope, he stopped. Someone had returned. Fresh tracks cut through the snow. This time, there was no doubt. The visitor had crossed two of Ethan's indicators. One fishing line had been broken. A marker stone had shifted. And near the northern support wall, something else waited. A deep scrape in the earth. Ethan walked closer. His stomach tightened. One of the temporary support braces had been partially cut. Not enough to collapse, not yet, but enough to weaken it. Enough to cause serious damage if construction continued unnoticed. Ranger began barking. Sharp. Urgent. The German shepherd raced toward the woods. Ethan followed. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Branches slapped against his jacket. Ranger stopped at the edge of the timber, growling, looking deeper into the trees. Someone had been there. Moments earlier, Ethan could feel it. But whoever it was had vanished. The forest stood silent, empty, watching. He slowly lowered the flashlight. The project wasn't just a joke anymore. Someone wanted it to fail. And for the first time, Ethan realized the biggest threat to the shelter might not be winter. It might be a person hiding somewhere in the valley, waiting for another chance. For nearly 2 weeks, Ethan found no answers, only questions. The damaged support beam was repaired before any serious harm could occur. The broken markers were replaced. New ones appeared. More carefully hidden, more difficult to spot. Whoever had come onto the property never returned, at least not in a way Ethan could prove. Still, the feeling remained, a quiet pressure in the back of his mind. The same instinct that had kept him alive years earlier. Something wasn't right. October arrived early in the Wind River Range. Too early. The mornings felt sharper, the nights colder. The first real frost appeared almost 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Most people welcomed it. Hunters looked forward to elk season. Ranchers prepared for winter as they always did. Life continued. But Ethan noticed things. Small things. The kind most people ignored. A flock of geese passed overhead one morning. Nothing unusual, except they were moving south far earlier than normal. The following week, mule deer began descending from higher elevations. Entire groups appeared along lower ridges, again, earlier than expected. Then, the squirrels started gathering aggressively. Pine cones vanished almost overnight. Even rangers seemed different. The German shepherd had always been alert. Now he was restless. Frequently he stood outside, staring north, toward the mountains, toward weather that hadn't arrived yet. Several times Ethan found the dog sitting motionless near the shelter entrance, nose lifted, testing the air, listening, waiting. One afternoon, Ethan stood beside the completed structure and looked across the valley. The shelter was finished. After months of work, planning, measuring, and construction, it finally existed. Part home, part refuge, part insurance policy against whatever winter decided to bring. The south-facing windows gleamed beneath the autumn sun. The ventilation system worked perfectly. The earth surrounding the structure already regulated temperature exactly as he'd hoped. Inside, the difference was remarkable. Cool during warm afternoons, comfortable during freezing nights. Everything functioned. Everything was ready. Yet instead of satisfaction, Ethan felt concern, because the signs continued to accumulate. That evening he sat at the kitchen table, studying weather maps, long-range forecasts. pressure patterns, jet stream projections. Years earlier, operating in remote regions had taught him something valuable. Weather killed people just as efficiently as enemies did, sometimes more efficiently. A deep Arctic air mass was beginning to form in northern Canada, still far away, still uncertain, but large, unusually large. Ethan stared at the map for a long time. Ranger rested beneath the table. The dog suddenly lifted his head, ears forward. The same reaction he'd shown repeatedly over the past week, as if he sensed something Ethan couldn't. 3 days later, Ethan drove into town. Murphy's diner was packed. The lunch crowd filled nearly every booth. Cole Barrett occupied his usual table near the front. The rancher was telling a story when Ethan entered. Laughter followed him through the door. Ethan ordered coffee. Then, something unusual happened. He stood instead of sitting. A few people noticed immediately. The room slowly quieted. Not completely. Just enough. Ethan wasn't a man known for speeches, which made everyone curious. He looked around the diner, then spoke calmly. "Winter's coming early." Several people exchanged glances. Nobody answered. Ethan continued, colder than normal. A rancher near the counter shrugged. "That's Wyoming." A few chuckles followed. Ethan nodded. "Maybe." Then he looked toward Cole. "I'm telling you anyway." The room grew quieter. "The deer are moving early. Migration patterns are off. Pressure changes have been unusual for weeks." Cole leaned back in his chair, amused. "You're predicting the weather now?" More laughter. Ethan ignored it. "Make sure your generators work," Cole smiled. "Appreciate the concern." The tone said otherwise. Someone near the back called out, "Should we all move into your bunker too?" The room erupted. Coffee nearly spilled from one table. A waitress covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. Even people who liked Ethan couldn't help smiling. The idea sounded ridiculous. Ethan simply placed money on the counter, finished his coffee, and left. Outside, Ranger waited in the truck. The dog's tail thumped once against the seat. Ethan climbed in. Neither looked back. Behind them, Murphy's diner returned to normal. Conversations resumed. The jokes continued. By sunset, half the valley knew Ethan Walker had warned everyone about winter. By morning, the story had become entertainment. The old veteran was predicting disasters now. Just another chapter in the legend of the vet hole. Yet over the next several days, temperatures continued falling. Storm systems began forming farther north, and Ranger grew increasingly uneasy. Then came the evening that changed everything. The sun had already disappeared behind the mountains. A cold wind swept through the trees. Ethan stepped outside carrying a lantern. Ranger. No answer. The yard stood empty. The porch empty. The truck empty. The dog was nowhere. At first, Ethan wasn't concerned. Ranger often explored nearby trails. But 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. Darkness settled over the mountain. Still no Ranger. Ethan walked the property. Called again. Nothing. By midnight, the lantern beam moved through the trees, searching the shelter, the creek, the ridge. Every place Ranger normally visited, the dog had vanished. And for the first time since adopting him, Ethan felt something far worse than concern. Because Ranger had never failed to come home before. Not once. By 1 o'clock in the morning, Ethan had searched every place the dog normally visited. The creek, the old logging trail, the southern ridge, the meadow behind the shelter. Nothing. No tracks. No bark. No movement. The lantern beam swept through the darkness as Ethan climbed higher into the timber. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset. Frost glittered across fallen branches. Every breath drifted white through the black forest. "Ranger!" His voice echoed through the trees. Silence answered. The quiet felt wrong. Ranger wasn't the kind of dog that wandered. He wasn't reckless. Years of search and rescue training had made him disciplined, methodical, reliable. If he wasn't home, something had happened. Ethan continued upward. The beam from his flashlight cut through the pines. Shadows stretched between trunks. The forest looked endless. For a while, he focused only on the search. Step, scan, listen, repeat. Then, a distant sound reached him. A helicopter. Far away. Barely audible. Yet the moment he heard it, something shifted. The mountain disappeared. The trees disappeared. Suddenly, he was somewhere else. Another country, another night, dust instead of snow, rotor blades hammering the darkness, men moving toward a landing zone, one of them laughing 30 seconds earlier, gone 30 seconds later. The memory hit hard. Sharp, unexpected. Ethan stopped walking. For a moment, his hand tightened around the flashlight. His breathing changed. Not panic, not exactly. Something older, something buried. A reaction that had survived long after the war ended. The sound faded. The forest returned. Pines. Frost. Wyoming. Ethan stood still for several seconds, then forced himself forward. Ranger needed him. Nothing else mattered. Around 3 a.m, he found the first clue, a paw print. Fresh, partially frozen along the edge of a muddy section near a creek crossing. Ethan dropped to one knee. Relief washed through him. Not because Ranger was safe, because now he had a direction. The track pointed north, toward rougher terrain, toward a series of rocky outcrops overlooking the valley. The dog had been moving quickly. Ethan followed. The terrain grew steeper, the trees thicker. Branches clawed at his jacket. Loose rocks shifted beneath his boots. Several times he lost the trail. Each time he found it again. Hours passed. The eastern horizon slowly began turning gray. Dawn approached. Then he heard something. Not a bark, not a growl. A whine. Faint, barely audible. Ethan froze. The sound came again, somewhere ahead. He moved faster. The slope narrowed into a rocky channel between two cliffs. The whine echoed upward. Ranger, no doubt now. Ethan scrambled over a fallen log and reached the edge of a deep crevice hidden beneath brush and loose stone. Then, he saw him. Ranger stood nearly 15 feet below, trapped, one rear leg wedged between rocks. The dog immediately looked up. His tail thumped once against the ground. Even now, even injured, happy to see him. Easy, buddy. Relief hit Ethan so hard he had to steady himself against the rock wall. The dog whined again, not from fear, from frustration. He wanted to get out. He couldn't. Ethan carefully climbed down. The confined space smelled of earth and pine needles. When he reached Ranger, he immediately examined the trapped leg. The joint wasn't broken, thank God, but the limb had been twisted badly, swollen, painful. It would take time to heal. As Ethan worked the leg free, he noticed something else. A shape curled against the back wall of the crevice. Small, motionless. At first he thought it was debris. Then it moved. A fawn. A young mule deer. No more than a few months old. Its side carried several fresh scratches. Predator marks. Likely coyotes. The animal trembled but didn't run. Too weak. Too exhausted. Ethan stared. Then looked at Ranger. The dog avoided eye contact. A guilty expression that somehow explained everything. The pieces fell into place. Ranger had found the injured fawn, stayed to protect it, got trapped in the process. The old soldier shook his head. Of course you did. Ranger's tail moved again. The dog looked completely unapologetic. The trip home took most of the morning. Ethan improvised a support wrap for the injured leg. Then, slowly guided Ranger down the mountain. The fawn remained hidden among the rocks. Safe for now. Several times, Ethan offered to carry part of Ranger's weight. The German shepherd refused. Stubborn, determined, proud. Some traits crossed species remarkably well. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun sat high above the valley. Ethan cleaned the injury, applied cold compresses, wrapped the leg properly. Ranger tolerated everything without complaint, only occasionally flinching. That evening, the dog lay beside the wood stove, exhausted. The house finally felt normal again, yet something troubled Ethan. Winter was close, closer than ever, and Ranger wasn't fully healthy. The shelter was finished. The warnings had been ignored. The weather continued changing. Now the one partner Ethan trusted most would enter the hardest season of the year with an injured leg. Outside, a cold wind swept through the mountains. Ranger lifted his head. For a moment, both of them looked toward the northern horizon. Dark clouds were gathering there, far away, but moving closer, and neither one of them knew that within weeks, the entire valley would be fighting for survival. The first storm arrived on November 11. Most people barely noticed it. A few inches of snow, some gusty wind, nothing unusual for Wyoming. Children built snowmen, ranchers plowed driveways. Life continued. Then the temperature dropped. Not dramatically at first, just enough to make people add another log to the fire, a heavier coat, an extra blanket, but the cold didn't leave. It stayed, and every morning it pushed a little farther downward. By the third week of November, Ethan had stopped checking forecasts. He didn't need them anymore. The signs were all around him. The northern sky carried a strange clarity. The air felt sharper, quieter. Even sound traveled differently. Ranger's injured leg was healing, but slowly. The dog still limped when he walked long distances, yet his behavior had become increasingly restless. Several times a day he stood near the shelter entrance, staring toward the mountains, waiting, listening, as though he could hear something still days away. The shelter itself was performing exactly as Ethan had hoped. The earth surrounding the structure held a stable temperature. A small fire kept the interior comfortable. Fuel consumption remained low. Every measurement matched his calculations. Still, Ethan kept bringing in supplies. More firewood, more canned food, more water, more medical supplies. The storage shelves gradually filled. People noticed. Of course they did. Murphy's Diner remained the center of every rumor. Looks like the old man is preparing for the apocalypse. Laughter followed. Cole Barrett led most of it. The rancher had become almost obsessed with mocking the shelter. Every conversation seemed to return to Ethan, eventually. One afternoon, Cole stood beside a group of ranchers outside the feed store. "You know what he's doing now?" The group looked interested. "Stockpiling soup." The men laughed. Cole grinned. "He probably thinks the world is ending." Across town, Ethan loaded another crate into his truck. He never heard the joke. Even if he had, it wouldn't have changed anything. Experience had taught him a simple lesson. People laughed at preparation until they needed it. On November 23, the first power outage hit part of the county. Only temporary, a few hours. Nothing serious. The local utility company restored service before midnight. Most residents forgot about it by morning. Ethan didn't. The following day, he tested every backup system inside the shelter. Again, everything worked. Ranger watched from his favorite spot near the stove. The dog seemed calmer inside the shelter than anywhere else, almost comfortable, as if he trusted the place. Then came November 27, the day everything changed. A massive Arctic air mass crossed the Canadian border. Meteorologists began issuing warnings. At first, people paid little attention. They had heard warnings before. This was Wyoming. Winter storms happened every year. But by evening, the forecast became impossible to ignore. Dangerously low temperatures, heavy snowfall, extreme wind chills, potential power disruptions. The language grew more urgent with each update. At Murphy's Diner, conversations finally shifted. Not completely, but enough. People started asking questions. How cold? How long? How much snow? No one had clear answers, only uncertainty. The storm reached the valley 2 days later. It arrived after dark. A wall of wind slammed into the mountains. Snow followed immediately. Visibility vanished. Roads disappeared. The world outside became white and moving. By midnight, drifts were already forming against houses. By dawn, several county roads were closed. The storm intensified, then intensified again. Temperatures plunged below 0, then below 10, then below 20. The cold seemed determined to find every weakness, every crack, every gap. Ending 1. Every mistake. Across the valley, furnaces ran constantly. Wood stoves burned without rest. Generators worked overtime. Families stayed indoors, waiting, hoping. The wind screamed through the night. One ranch lost power completely. Another suffered a frozen water line. A third watched helplessly as several cattle collapsed from exposure. No one laughed anymore. Not because of Ethan, because nobody had energy left for laughing. Every hour became a battle against the weather. 3 days into the storm, the county emergency center became overwhelmed. Calls poured in. Downed power lines. Medical concerns. Stranded vehicles. Fuel shortages. Some requests simply couldn't be reached. Conditions were too dangerous. Meanwhile, Ethan remained mostly invisible. The shelter sat quietly on the mountainside, hidden beneath snow, protected by earth. Its lights glowed warmly behind reinforced windows. Inside, temperatures remained stable. The fire burned steadily. The supplies stayed dry. Ranger slept near the stove, occasionally lifting his head whenever the wind shook the outer walls. Outside, the valley continued struggling. The storm refused to leave. Another day passed. Then, another. People stopped talking about weather forecasts. They focused on survival. One evening, Cole Barrett stood at the window of his ranch house. The power had failed hours earlier. His backup generator sputtered and died shortly afterward. The house felt colder every minute. His wife sat wrapped in blankets. His grandson slept beneath layers of quilts. Cole stared through the blowing snow, and that's when he saw it. A light. Far away. High on the mountainside. Steady. Unmoving. The same light that would eventually draw dozens of desperate people toward Ethan Walker's shelter. The same light that had already become the only beacon, still shining through the storm. And for the first time since the jokes began, Cole Barrett felt something he never expected to feel. He hoped Ethan Walker had been right. The storm entered its second week. That alone would have been remarkable. What made it terrifying was that it showed no signs of weakening. The wind never truly stopped. Snow continued piling against houses. Temperatures remained locked far below normal. Each morning people woke hoping for relief. Each morning, the thermometer delivered disappointment. Cole Barrett's ranch had become a different place. The large diesel generator that normally powered the property sat silent beneath a layer of ice. Fuel lines had frozen. Repair crews couldn't reach them. The roads were gone. His cattle huddled against fences and windbreaks. Every trip outside cost energy. Every hour consumed supplies. Inside the house, his grandson Tyler sat wrapped in blankets beside a propane heater. The boy tried to act brave, but Cole noticed the questions in his eyes. Children always knew more than adults believed. That evening, Tyler looked toward the dark window. "Grandpa?" Cole turned. "You think this storm is going to end?" Cole opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. Instead, he looked toward the distant glow shining through the storm. The light on the mountainside. The light everyone could see now. The light nobody laughed at anymore. Hours later, Cole made a decision. He layered on every piece of winter clothing he owned. Heavy coat, insulated gloves, wool hat, snow goggles. His wife watched from the doorway. "You're not really going out there. I need to know." She understood immediately. Neither of them said Ethan's name. They didn't have to. The trip took nearly an hour. Normally it would have taken 15 minutes. The truck couldn't make it. Nothing could. Cole traveled on foot through waist-deep drifts. Several times he nearly turned back. The cold seemed alive. It clawed through every layer, stole heat from his body, turned, breathing into work. But the light remained visible, a fixed point in a world that had become chaos. Eventually, the hillside emerged from the storm. At first, he could barely recognize it. Snow covered most of the structure. The mountain seemed to have swallowed it. Only the reinforced entrance remained visible. Warm yellow light spilled across the snow. Cole stopped. For a long moment, he simply stared. He remembered every joke, every insult, every laugh. The memory sat heavily inside him. Then, he stepped forward. Before he reached the door, it opened. Ranger stood there. The German shepherd's injured leg still carried a slight limp, but his posture remained alert, professional, evaluating. The dog studied Cole for several seconds, then stepped aside, almost as if granting permission. A familiar voice came from inside. "Doors open, Cole." The warmth hit him immediately. Not furnace heat, not the dry blast of forced air. Something better. Steady warmth, comfortable warmth, the kind that settled into your bones. Cole removed his gloves. His fingers didn't hurt anymore. For the first time in days, he could feel them. The shelter looked nothing like the hole people had imagined. The place was organized, efficient, practical. Every square foot served a purpose. Storage shelves lined one wall. Water containers occupied another. Medical supplies sat neatly arranged. Ventilation moved fresh air throughout the structure. The temperature felt almost unbelievable. Outside, it was nearly 30 below. Inside, it felt like early fall. Ethan sat near the stove, reading from an old notebook. He looked up briefly, then returned to the page. No smug smile. No satisfaction. "No, I told you so." Just calm. That bothered Cole more than any speech could have. "You knew." Ethan closed the notebook. "Knew what?" "This." Ethan glanced toward the ceiling, toward the earth above them, toward the storm. "I knew winter was coming." Cole shook his head. "No." His voice lowered. "You knew this would work." For a moment, neither man spoke. The only sound came from the stove and the distant wind. Finally, Ethan stood. "Come here." He led Cole toward the rear wall. The concrete gave way to exposed sections of packed earth. Ethan placed a hand against it. "The mountain doesn't care about opinions." Cole stared. "The ground stays stable. The wind stays outside. Heat stays in." He shrugged. "That's all. That's all." The words sounded absurd. Weeks of suffering, months of ridicule, years of accepted assumptions. And the answer had been sitting inside a hillside. Cole slowly looked around the shelter again, then noticed something else. Other people. A retired couple from a neighboring ranch. A widow from the valley. 2 children sleeping peacefully on cots. They had already come here. Others had figured it out. The realization landed harder than anything else. People weren't coming because they admired Ethan. They were coming because they needed him. Outside, the storm continued raging. Inside, for the first time in days, Cole felt hope. Then the shelter's radio crackled. A voice broke through the static. Weak, urgent. Someone was missing. A family hadn't made it home before the storm closed the roads. No one knew where they were. The signal vanished almost immediately. The room fell silent. Ranger lifted his head. His ears turned toward the radio. And Ethan Walker slowly stood up. Because everyone else heard a transmission, Ranger heard something more. The German Shepherd was already on his feet before the radio fell silent. Every person inside the shelter looked toward Ethan. Ranger looked toward the door. His ears stood forward, his body rigid, listening. The radio operator's broken message replayed in everyone's mind. A family, missing. Last seen driving home before the storm closed the mountain roads. No confirmed location, no contact. No rescue crews available. Conditions were too dangerous. The county had already suspended most recovery efforts until visibility improved. The problem was simple. Visibility wasn't improving. It was getting worse. Ethan crossed the room and switched on a weather monitor. The numbers weren't encouraging. 34 below. Wind gusts approaching 50 miles per hour. Snowfall continuing. A search under those conditions bordered on impossible. Cole Barrett stood beside the stove. "Nobody can make it out there." Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved to Ranger. The dog was pacing now. Not nervous. Focused. The same behavior Ethan had seen years earlier during search operations. The same behavior Ranger displayed when he picked up a scent, or detected something unusual. Then the dog stopped. He turned toward the northern wall. One sharp bark. The room fell silent. Ranger limped toward the entrance. Another bark. Ethan knew that bark. Not fear. Not warning. Direction. The dog wanted to go. A woman sitting near the storage shelves shook her head. "You can't be serious." Neither Ethan nor Ranger looked at her. The old soldier was already pulling on winter gear. Heavy insulated jacket, snow goggles, thermal gloves. Movement became automatic. Years of training, compressed preparation into seconds. Check gear, check light, check communication, check route. The process felt familiar. Too familiar. For a brief moment, while tightening a strap on his pack, another memory surfaced. Dark mountains. Another winter. Another search. A young soldier missing after a nighttime patrol. The same urgency, the same uncertainty, the same hope that they weren't already too late. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came. Ranger stood waiting beside the door, ready. Ethan looked toward Cole. "Watch the shelter." Cole stared at him. "You actually think you can find them?" Ethan glanced at the dog. "I think he can." 10 minutes later, they stepped into the storm. The cold struck immediately. Even with layers of protection, it felt brutal. Snow blasted sideways through the darkness. The world beyond 20 feet barely existed. Ranger moved ahead. Not fast, not reckless, purposeful. His injured leg still caused a slight limp, but it didn't slow him much. The dog seemed locked onto something invisible, a trail hidden beneath wind and snow. Ethan followed. The route surprised him. Ranger wasn't heading toward town, or toward the main highway. He was leading them deeper into the mountains, toward an area locals called Devil's Draw, a narrow valley notorious for drifting snow, the kind of place vehicles disappeared during winter storms. The journey took nearly 2 hours. Several times Ethan stopped to check terrain, snowpack, slope angle, wind direction, old habits from mountain operations and survival training. One wrong decision could trigger an avalanche. One bad route could trap them. Ranger never hesitated. The dog continued forward. then suddenly stopped. Every muscle in his body tightened. He barked. Once, twice, then started digging. Snow flew behind him. Ethan hurried forward. At first, he saw nothing, only a drift piled against a cluster of pine trees. Then his flashlight caught something beneath the snow. Metal, a side mirror, the corner of a windshield, a vehicle, half buried. Jesus. Ethan dropped to his knees and began digging. Ranger worked beside him, ignoring the pain in his injured leg, ignoring exhaustion, ignoring the cold. Together they cleared the driver's door. Inside sat a family of 3, a husband, a wife, and a little girl bundled beneath blankets. The adults were conscious but weak. The child wasn't moving. Fear tightened Ethan's chest. He opened the door. Cold air rushed inside. The father blinked against the light. "You found us." His voice barely carried. The little girl suddenly stirred. A small movement, then another. Alive. The relief hit harder than the cold. Ethan immediately switched into action. Assess, condition, prevent further exposure. Establish evacuation plan. No wasted motion. No panic. The same mindset that had carried him through crises before. Then a sharp yelp cut through the storm. Ethan spun around. Ranger. The dog had slipped while digging near the vehicle. His already injured leg had twisted beneath him. For a moment, he couldn't stand. The sound tore through Ethan more deeply than he expected. The family was alive, but now Ranger was hurt again. The German shepherd struggled upright. Snow coated his fur. Pain flashed across his face. Yet he immediately limped back toward the child, as if checking whether she was safe. Even now, even injured, still working, still protecting. Ethan knelt beside him. A gloved hand rested against the dog's neck. "Good boy." Ranger leaned briefly into the touch, then looked toward the storm, toward home, toward the shelter waiting somewhere beyond the darkness. And for the first time that night, Ethan allowed himself to believe they might all make it back alive. The return journey was slower, much slower. The little girl rode inside a rescue sled Ethan kept for emergencies. Her mother walked beside it. Her father helped pull when he could. The storm still hammered the mountains, but something had changed. There was direction now. Purpose, hope. Ranger limped ahead through the blowing snow. Every few minutes, Ethan called him back. Every few minutes, the dog ignored him and pushed forward again. Working, always working. By the time the shelter finally emerged through the storm, dawn was beginning to brighten the eastern sky. The steel door swung open before they reached it. People rushed forward. Blankets appeared. Hot drinks, medical kits, helping hands. The missing family disappeared into the warmth. A cheer almost broke out when the little girl opened her eyes fully and asked for water. Several people wiped tears from their faces. Others simply sat down in relief. The tension of the previous days finally had somewhere to go. Ethan barely noticed. His attention stayed fixed on Ranger. The German shepherd collapsed near the stove the moment they came inside. Exhaustion had finally caught him. Ethan carefully examined the injured leg. The old injury had been aggravated. Nothing broken, but painful. The dog winced as Ethan adjusted the wrap, then immediately rested his head on Ethan's boot. Satisfied. Mission complete. For a long moment, neither moved. The shelter remained quiet. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, people watched. Not the shelter, not the supplies. Ethan. For the first time, they were seeing him clearly. Not as the strange veteran living alone on a mountain. Not as the man who built a house inside a hillside. Not as the subject of endless jokes. Something else. The person who had prepared when nobody else did. The person who had opened his doors when everyone needed help. The person who had gone back out into a deadly storm when everyone else stayed inside. That afternoon, while the wind rattled the ventilation shafts overhead, conversations began changing. A retired rancher named Walter Harris sat near the stove. "You really built all this yourself?" Ethan shrugged. "Mostly." Walter looked around. "How'd you even know where to start?" Ethan stared into his coffee for a moment. A memory surfaced. Dust, concrete barriers, mountains half a world away. Forward operating bases tucked into hillsides. Temporary shelters reinforced against weather and danger alike. Afghanistan. Picked up a few ideas overseas. That was all he said. But people wanted to hear more. Not because they were curious anymore, because they were trying to understand. Cole Barrett sat quietly in the corner. The loudest voice in town had become the quietest man in the room. He watched Ethan help an elderly couple adjust blankets, then watched him repair a faulty lantern, then watched him check Ranger's bandage for the third time. Finally, Cole stood. The room gradually fell silent. Everyone knew what was coming. Cole walked toward Ethan. The rancher's face looked older than it had a month earlier, more tired, less certain. For a moment he struggled to find words. Then he cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology. Everything." Nobody spoke. Even the children seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Cole looked directly at Ethan. "I laughed at you." He paused. "I encouraged other people to laugh at you." The room remained still. "I thought you were crazy." A few people lowered their eyes, because they had done the same thing. Cole glanced around the shelter, at the families sleeping safely, at the supplies, at the warmth, at the dog stretched beside the stove. Then back to Ethan. "I was wrong." The words seemed surprisingly difficult for him to say. Ethan studied him for a second, then nodded once. Nothing more. No speech, no lecture, no victory. Just a nod. For some reason, that made the apology feel even more powerful. Cole let out a breath, part relief, part regret. The moment passed. Conversation slowly returned, but something fundamental had changed. That evening, the storm finally began to weaken. Not much, just enough. The winds eased slightly. Visibility improved a little. For the first time in days, people could imagine life beyond survival. They could imagine what would come next. Rebuilding, repairing, learning. As darkness settled over the mountains once more, Ethan stepped outside alone. The air still carried a brutal chill. Snow covered everything. The valley below looked transformed, quiet, white, endless. Ranger limped through the doorway a moment later and settled beside him. The dog leaned gently against his leg. Together they looked down toward the distant lights, slowly returning across the valley. Ethan scratched behind Ranger's ears. The dog closed his eyes. Content. For years, Ethan had carried the feeling that he no longer quite belonged anywhere. Not fully in the civilian world, not fully in the world he left behind. Some wounds never completely disappeared. Some memories never stopped visiting. But standing there beneath the Wyoming sky, with the storm finally losing its grip and Ranger beside him, something felt different. Not healed, not perfect. Just different. As if the mountain itself had quietly accepted them. And below, in the valley that once laughed at the old soldier and his dog, people were already beginning to talk about what they would build when winter finally let them go. Winter did not end overnight. The storm loosened its grip slowly, day by day, degree by degree. Roads reappeared beneath layers of packed snow. Utility crews reached isolated ranches. Generators came back online. Life returned one careful step at a time. But nobody in the valley forgot what had happened. Not a single family. The stories spread long before the snow melted. Stories about the shelter in the hillside. Stories about the old Special Forces veteran who had seen danger before everyone else. Stories about the German shepherd who had found a family buried beneath the storm. And most of all, stories about a place that stayed warm while everything else froze. By March, visitors arrived almost daily. Some came carrying notebooks. Others brought measuring tapes. A few simply wanted to see the shelter for themselves. Ethan never charged anyone, never gave speeches, never acted like an expert. He simply answered questions, showed people the ventilation system, explained how the earth stabilized temperature, pointed out drainage routes and wind exposure, then returned to work. The valley did the rest. By summer, construction projects appeared across the region. South-facing shelters, earth-covered storage rooms, partially buried workshops. People adapted the idea to fit their own land, their own needs. Some were large, some were small, but every one of them carried a piece of the lesson Ethan had learned in that old root cellar. Work with the mountain, not against it. Meanwhile, Ranger recovered slowly. The second injury took more out of him than the first. The limp remained. Some mornings, it looked better. Other mornings it didn't. The dog never complained, never slowed down unless Ethan forced him to. Yet age was beginning to show. The gray fur around his muzzle spread a little farther. His naps grew longer. His steps became more deliberate. One afternoon, Ethan found him sleeping beside the shelter entrance, exactly where he used to stand guard. The sight stopped him. For years, Ranger had been beside him through every lonely morning, every sleepless night, Every bad memory, every mile. The dog had never asked for anything except to stay close. Ethan sat beside him and scratched behind his ears. Ranger opened one eye, satisfied, then went back to sleep. A year after the storm, the town organized a community gathering. Not a festival, not exactly, more of a celebration, a thank you. Families arrived from all over the valley. Children played in open fields. Neighbors shared food. Stories flowed easily. For the first time in a long while, people talked about that winter without fear. Near sunset, Mayor Susan Keller stepped onto a small wooden platform. She cleared her throat. The crowd gradually quieted. "We all know why we're here." A few heads nodded. "We survived because someone prepared when the rest of us didn't." People immediately turned toward Ethan. He looked uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. The mayor smiled. "We'd like to rename the shelter." The crowd applauded. Ethan shook his head before she even finished. "No." Laughter rolled through the gathering. The mayor tried again. "Ethan, no." More laughter. The answer wasn't changing. He had spent most of his life avoiding attention. He wasn't about to start now. The mayor exchanged a glance with several town leaders. Then she smiled. "We thought you might say that." Ethan narrowed his eyes. That usually meant trouble. "The shelter won't be renamed." He relaxed slightly. Then she continued. "But the county approved another idea." A large wooden sign stood covered beneath a cloth near the road. 2 children pulled the cloth away. The crowd immediately erupted into applause. Ethan stared. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The sign read, "Ranger Ridge Road." The German Shepherd lifted his head from beneath Ethan's chair. Several children rushed over to pet him. The old dog accepted the attention with quiet dignity. A local rancher wiped his eyes. Another man laughed and pretended he wasn't emotional. Even Cole Barrett smiled. The former skeptic walked over and crouched beside Ranger. "You earned that, buddy." Ranger responded by placing one paw on Cole's boot. The crowd laughed. The moment felt simple, honest, right. That evening, after everyone had gone home, silence returned to the mountain. The sun dipped behind the Wind River Range. Orange light stretched across the valley. Dozens of homes glowed below. Some old, some newly built, many inspired by the shelter everyone once mocked. Ethan sat outside on a wooden bench. The air carried the warmth of late summer. Beside him, Ranger rested his head on Ethan's leg. The dog was asleep before the stars appeared. Ethan looked out across the valley. A year earlier he had stood here alone. A man people laughed at. A veteran many didn't understand. A neighbor most ignored. Now lights dotted the mountainside. Warm lights. Steady lights. Families gathered inside homes that might not have existed without one stubborn idea. The wind moved gently through the pines. No sirens. No storms. No helicopters. Just peace. The kind that arrives quietly. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Ethan rested a hand on Ranger's shoulder. The old dog didn't wake. He simply shifted closer. And together they watched the lights shining across the valley. Lights that existed because preparation defeated pride. Because loyalty outlasted ridicule. Because one veteran trusted what he knew. And one German Shepherd never left his side. If Ranger's loyalty touched your heart, leave a simple 1 in the comments. And if you believe preparation, courage, and loyalty still matter in this world, leave a 0. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd love to know who's still watching all the way to the end. And if you enjoyed this story, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every week, you'll discover another unforgettable story of courage, survival, loyal dogs, and ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Until the next story, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and never underestimate the difference one loyal companion can make. We'll see you in the next one.